Hi folks, I wanted to put together a video sort of walking through my second build of my Biopod. The first time around didn't go super well. I made a couple of mistakes and learned a few things throughout that process and while following a few people online and stuff building their Biopods. So I wanted to go through the process of building it out again. I was having certain mold issues and certain weird plant issues and such, so I figured it would be a good idea to sort of rip everything out and sort of go from scratch. So I've already emptied out the Biopod. It's ready to go. This is the Aqua model, and I don't have the platform set up either, just so I can use the whole thing in a terrestrial form. I've got two Azurius frogs waiting for their new home as well, just sort of in temporary containers for the time being. I'll be moving these folks out. I had a bunch of these plants in my Biopod previously. I've taken them all out. Might use some of them, might not. We'll see how it goes. So here's sort of a giant pile of all the supplies that I'll be using. I've got some of this aquarium gravel that I'll be using as well as sort of a drainage layer. I already have 3 bags of this washed and ready to go. I just have a couple extra bags in case I need it. I've got some AVG style mix. I've got this from Integrated Exotics over in Montreal. I've got a couple of bromeliads, I've got some isopods ready to go, a coconut hut, and one of these monkey paws as well to maybe create some sort of space for the frogs to get some water and just like maybe build some moss around that. I've also got some activated carbon to create some sort of filtration layer and just like, you know, keep things nice and fresh in the vivarium. I've also got some gloves. My hands get kind of gross when I'm working with this sort of stuff, so just wanted to keep it a little bit extra clean. I've got this landscape fabric. I'm going to be using this to create a separation between the drainage layer and the substrate. I had actually ordered a very small roll of this, but the company actually messed up and sent me a giant roll instead. I'm not going to complain. I'll use it. Looks pretty all right, and I'll have tons and tons left over for any future builds that I do as well. I've got a bunch of wood as well. I found this near a river. I grabbed it. I grabbed a whole bunch. I cleaned them up. I washed them with hot water, put them in the oven for a little bit as well, just to clean off and just to, you know, kill off any bugs or anything that might sit in these. I'm pretty stoked to use these instead of having to buy a whole bunch from pet stores who sell them for quite a whole bunch of money. And last but not least, we have a bunch of sphagnum moss. I've already taken a whole bunch out and hydrated it with distilled water, so this should be ready to go for the background as well. Forgot to mention a couple more things. I've got some dwarf white isopods. These will be there for the frogs to eat and also just to help keep the vivarium nice and fresh. I have a couple additional plants that I picked up from a local expo that just happened a couple days ago. I also have a whole bunch of moss that I've picked up over the past couple of weeks. I've been hydrating this, I've been cleaning it all up, ready to go for the Biopod. Alright, so I just finished adding the sphagnum moss to the back wall. For those who are new to the world of Biopod, the Biopods have a back wall that can be irrigated with the water that sits in the bottom section. It passes through the sphagnum moss and you can attach plants and other mosses directly to the sphagnum moss to continuously keep them hydrated since the sphagnum moss retains a lot of moisture. Alright, next up I'm going to be adding the gravel to the sides of the Biopod. So one of the things that bothers me a lot or sort of like irritates me when it comes to the filtration and the drainage and substrate layers of the different vivariums is that you can see like a very, very clear sort of like a separation between the drainage layer and the substrate. There's always like a super harsh line between the two different layers, especially when you use very contrasting drainage stuff as opposed to the substrate. So previously I was using this white gravel type stuff that was very light and very awesome, but looked very, very weird against the color of the substrate. So one of the things that I saw recently in the Biopod videos is that they sort of build up a gravel wall up maybe like a couple inches high, And they only keep them maybe about like an inch deep on all sides to sort of create like this facade that exists on the outer perimeter of the bottom portion of the biopod, and then fill the center up with the drainage medium that you want to use, because I mean, you could use gravel for the entire thing, but gravel is pretty heavy, so you probably want to opt for something that's a little bit lighter. So you fill up the rest with something a little bit lighter, whatever, like hydro balls or whatever it might be, and then you put the substrate on top of that. I'm probably going to have a mesh divider between the two, but yeah, so that's sort of what my objective is. Ideally, I want to have a nice, concise or consistent look with this particular gravel all around the sides. So looking at it from the outside, it won't look like there's multiple layers. It'll just look like one seamless chunk of substrate or bottom section of the biopod. So I'm adding the gravel in now and trying to keep it to the outer regions of the bottom of the biopod. And I want to try and build up a little wall on all the sides and then fill the center up with the drainage substance. I've just finished adding in the gravel in the base of the biopod. It's only an inch at the most thick all the way around. I tried to get it as close as possible. I was able to fill in the gap between the black base and the gravel with some leftover drainage material that I had from the previous build. That way it keeps the biopod a little bit lighter because it's not using gravel for the entire base, and at the same time I get to retain this nice looking finish on the outside without having to see any of this not so pretty white drainage material. So the next step was to cut a piece of the weed blocker that I had in that massive roll down to size. It doesn't need to go all the way to the edges. I just want to make sure that it covers a large enough surface area where the substrate is going to sit on top, and that'll make sure that the substrate doesn't seep into the drainage layer here. You'll notice that towards the back, the pipe that connects the entire system up with the irrigation system sort of gets in the way. So what I'm going to do is just take a scissor and just like make a small little cut here, and that'll be enough to like push those pieces aside. All right, so now with that little incision made, I'm able to push this entire weed blocker all the way to the back. That'll make sure that none of the substrate that sits towards the back is going to fall into the drainage layer. I will, however, also add some drainage material towards the back here, just to make sure that, I mean, there are still like small little gaps in the back. I didn't do the best job cutting the weed blocker either. So just like double check and make sure that nothing falls back in there. So next up, I'm going to add a tiny bit of this activated carbon, sort of just all across the surface of the weed blocker. This will act as a filtration layer, and it'll also make sure that the biopod smells nice and fresh at all times. It's not necessary, but a lot of people do like to include it just to give it the extra level of filtration and keep it smelling nice and clean. So I'm going to go do that now. All right, so I've added a very, very thin layer of the activated carbon across the entire base of the biopod. I've also added some more gravel in at the back just to make sure none of the substrate that we add further on top of this falls through any of the cracks at the edge towards the back of the biopod. So I'm now adding some substrate to the base of the biopod. I'm trying to keep most of the substrate towards the back to create a slope that's higher at the back and lower at the front. That creates a sense of depth, and it'll allow me to hide a lot of this gap that exists between the back wall and sort of like the base of the biopod. that's sort of like a personal preference. Like you don't have to do that. You can keep the gap there if you want. I like to keep it hidden as much as possible. Then this also creates sort of like an elevated place for me to plant some plants as well that might need deeper roots and such as well. So I'm going to keep going. I've emptied out one bag so far. I still have a bunch of empty space here that I'm going to need with. Then I'm going to fill up with the second bag and continue to create a slope. Hopefully you can sort of start to tell from the side. Not too much just yet, but hopefully as I add more, it'll become more apparent. Next, while I'm doing this, I'm also going to open up the can, or like the container of isopods and springtails, and sort of like dump that into the mix as well. I'm going to be trying to keep this all wet as well. I'm just like spraying it down every now and then too. That way the isopods and the springtails can get to work right away while I continue to work on the rest of the biopod. So I've added a bunch more substrate, and now I'm going to add in the dwarf isopods. I'm just going to open up the container and pretty much just dunk this whole thing in. There we go. You probably won't be able to see them on the camera. They are very, very tiny. I'm going to sort of just mix this in a little bit and then continue to add more substrate on top. So I finished adding in a whole bunch of the substrate. I might add a little bit more later on. I've got a nice sort of slope going as well towards the back. I don't know if you can see very well on the camera. I also added a bunch more gravel around the sides just to fill up the perimeter a little bit more. And what I'm going to do next is grab some of the pieces of wood that I have and start creating sort of like the structure that I want within the biopod. I'm going to be using a bunch of the gravel to sort of like mount them in place and use some more substrate as well to sort of like, position them and maybe dig a small hole and like bury a couple ends in there as well, just to make it seem a little bit more natural that, the pieces of wood are sort of coming out of the substrate rather than just sitting on top. So I'm going to take a stab at that now. All right, so I've just finished doing the first pass and the basic hardscape for my biopod. I've added 3 big pieces of wood. I've added the cocoa hut and I've added the monkey pod. I filled it up with a little bit of gravel just so it'll help retain some water a little bit better. I added a bunch of substrate sort of like in and around all of the wooden pieces just to make it seem a little bit more natural. Added some in here as well, some around the cocoa hut. Just to give it a little bit more of a naturalistic vibe. Next I'm going to add in some more of the gravel along the sides and sort of just finish off the edges and the trim of the biopod. Next I'm also going to add some additional sphagnum moss to the various pieces of wood. I want to keep some of the stuff exposed here because I think it looks really cool, but I want to definitely add a whole bunch of sphagnum moss all across the back here, maybe a little bit inside here. That way I'll be able to mount some plants and some moss over on top. It'll give them some nice, it'll just retain some moisture, so it'll keep them nice and hydrated. Otherwise, without that, depending on what plant you put there, it might die out. I'll probably add a little bit on top of the cocoa hut as well to make it look a little bit more, like part of the environment. I kind of think cocoa huts look kind of strange, but I know that they're necessary to make them feel a little bit more, make the frogs feel comfortable and make them feel safe. I'll eventually add a petri dish as well underneath these to give them a nice space to lay some eggs if they choose to do so. All right, so I'm gonna do those 2 steps next, the gravel and the sphagnum moss, and then it'll come down to the last step, which will be planting. Okay, so I just finished adding in some more gravel and the sphagnum moss, and I am pretty happy with how it's looking. It's seeming a little bit natural. The cocoa hut sort of like blends into this piece of wood because of the sphagnum moss over on top of both of them. That makes the coconut feel more natural, which is awesome. The sphagnum moss fit in really nicely on these like leveled out places on the wood pieces, and hopefully I'll be able to mount some wood there. I have a tiny bit of sphagnum moss left. I might use that in certain other spots, so we'll see. But for the time being, I'm pretty happy. Next up, I'm going to get to the planting. So I've started to add some moss to the back wall. The way I'm doing this is I'm holding a piece of moss down fairly tightly against the sphagnum moss, and then using some of these clips that I ordered online to just push in and like attach the moss to the sphagnum moss or to the back wall. So these little pieces, a whole bunch of them come with the Biopod, but I ended up ordering an entire set. They were super cheap. I think they were like $2 for 100 of them. I think they're called orchid pins or orchid mounting pins or something like that. I highly recommend ordering a whole bunch just so you don't have to, you know, be like very like picky with where you have to attach them. I just get to add like 3 pins to this one small piece of moss. I'm going to keep on doing that. I've got a bunch of moss. I want to get the entire background full and then add a whole bunch of other plants. So I just finished planting the Biopod and I'm super stoked with how it's looking. I was able to attach a giant amount of moss throughout the back wall. I have a huge piece of moss sitting over on top of this piece of wood and sort of on top of the cocoa hut as well. I've got some Salinigella, or rubbish at pronouncing it, but some of that over here. I've got some vining stuff here. I've got some baby tears in the back. Hopefully these will start to, you know, root in again and grow a whole bunch more. I have a couple of plants back here as well. Some more vining stuff over here, a peperonia over there, some margravia, and a bunch of bromeliads. I don't fully remember the names of all the other plants and such. I'll see if I can get a list together for those. So the last thing left is to add in the isopods and then cover the entire sort of substrate area with leaf litter, and then we'll be good to go, and then the Azurias frogs can finally come back home. All right, and I'm done. I'm pretty pumped with how the whole thing turned out. The leaf litter is in, the isopods are in. I sprayed the whole thing down a whole bunch just to get everything nice and hydrated, and to get the whole biological cycle up and running. I'm just going to let it sit for another couple of minutes, spray it down some more, and then add the frogs back in.